It was a crisp morning when the quiet rhythm of my wife's unpacking was interrupted by a knock so sharp and commanding that it echoed through our new home. She paused, hands still gripping a box of kitchenware before setting it down slowly. When she opened the door, two men stood there in what appeared to be police uniforms, their faces stern, their tone even harsher. "Ma'am, we've received complaints," the taller one said, adjusting his cap as if to emphasize his authority. "You're trespassing on HOA property. We'll need you to leave immediately." My wife's heart raced. She wasn't unfamiliar with confrontation, but there was something off about the way these men carried themselves. Their uniforms didn't quite match. The patches looked cheaply stitched, and the badges seemed more like props than anything official. Yet they spoke with such force that a less observant person might have crumbled under their presence. "Excuse me," my wife replied firmly, though her pulse quickened. "This is our property. We bought it legally, and I am not under any HOA jurisdiction." The shorter man smirked. "That's what everyone says. But the HOA rules are clear. This land is under their control. You either comply or you'll face arrest." The word arrest cut through the air like a blade. My wife clenched her fists. She knew her rights, but the intimidation was meant to frighten her into submission. Still, she stood tall. "Show me your IDs," she demanded. That's when the cracks began to show. The taller man hesitated, his hand hovering near his pocket, but never reaching inside. The other shifted nervously, avoiding eye contact. My wife's instincts screamed louder now. These weren't real officers. They were imposters, sent by the very HOA that had harassed us from the moment we moved in. She didn't back down. Instead, she stepped onto the porch, closing the distance between her and the so-called officers. "You don't scare me," she said firmly. "And you don't belong here. If you don't leave now, I'll be the one calling the real police." But the taller man leaned in with a sneer. "Lady, don't test us. We can make things very difficult for you and your husband. You don't want to find out what happens to people who defy the HOA." My wife's resolve hardened. She wasn't just standing her ground, she was standing for something bigger. This wasn't about a petty dispute. It was about intimidation, bullying, and a group of self-entitled neighbors who thought they could rewrite the law. She calmly pulled out her phone, dialed a number, and let the line ring. The men exchanged nervous glances. "Who are you calling?" The shorter one barked, his voice losing its steadiness. "My husband," she replied coolly. "And you'll want to stick around for what comes next." As the call connected, her voice softened for just a moment. "Honey, you'll want to get here right now. The HOA just sent fake cops to our door." The silence on the other end was short-lived before I answered with measured fury. "Stay calm. Don't let them touch." I'll be there in minutes." The imposters shifted uncomfortably, their bluff unraveling by the second. What they didn't know was that we had anticipated something like this. From the moment the HOA began sending threatening letters, we documented everything, every call, every letter, every veiled threat. And now, with these imposters standing on our porch, the HOA had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. By the time I pulled into the driveway, their confidence was gone. But they still lingered, as if unwilling to admit defeat. My wife stood tall at the door, her presence a shield of defiance. When I stepped out of the car, my eyes locked on the imposters, and I spoke with a voice that cut through their facade. "You've made a very big mistake," I said coldly, "and you're about to regret it." They tried to mutter excuses, but it was too late. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have guessed, was that the property they claimed belonged to the HOA didn't just belong to us. My wife held the deed that gave her ownership of a critical piece of land, one the HOA themselves had been using for years without realizing its true owner. And in that moment, with the imposters squirming under the weight of exposure, the truth was about to unfold in ways that would shatter the HOA's arrogance forever. The tension on our porch was thick enough to choke on. The fake cops were still fumbling, trying to recover their bluff, when I took a step closer and held up a folder I had brought from my office. Inside was the ultimate weapon against their intimidation, proof of ownership. "You want to talk about HOA rules?" I said, my voice steady, sharp, unyielding. "Let's talk about the fact that my wife owns this property outright. Not only this house, I flipped open the folder to reveal the deed, but also the parcel of land your HOA headquarters sits on. Every rule you claim, every meeting you hold, every ounce of power you think you have, it all sits on land that belongs to her. The impostors froze. Their jaws tightened, their eyes darted, their bravado evaporating in real time. They had been sent to intimidate my wife into compliance, but instead they had stumbled into a legal trap so airtight that even the HOA board wouldn't be able to wiggle out of it. My wife stepped forward now, fire in her eyes. She pointed at the men and said with a voice that shook with authority, "You've trespassed, you've impersonated law enforcement, and you've threatened me on my own property. You're done." And then she dialed another number, the actual local police. Within minutes, the sound of sirens echoed down the street. The impostors panicked, their earlier arrogance melting into desperation. They muttered excuses, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that they had been contracted by the HOA. But the moment real officers stepped onto our driveway, the impostors' story fell apart. The officers wasted no time. Their uniforms were real, their authority unquestionable, and their disgust at what they uncovered was obvious. "Impersonating a police officer is a serious crime," one officer barked as he slapped handcuffs on the taller man. "And you've just turned a civil dispute into a criminal case." The HOA members who had orchestrated the scheme didn't stay hidden for long. Within days, word spread across the community. The HOA had hired imposters to threaten us. And the truth of our ownership was undeniable. My wife's deed made it clear. She wasn't just a homeowner, she was the landlord of the very property the HOA depended on. The board's arrogance crumbled. Suddenly their threats, their fines, their smug sense of control, all of it vanished under the weight of one undeniable fact. They weren't in charge anymore. My wife was. In the weeks that followed, the HOA's entire power structure unraveled. Members resigned, lawsuits piled up, and the once feared board was nothing more than a cautionary tale. Neighbors who once sided with the HOA began to approach us with apologies, admitting they had been too afraid to speak up. But for my wife, the victory wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up to bullies who thought they were above the law. She had faced down imposters, exposed corruption, and reclaimed her dignity in the face of intimidation. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, she turned to me and said softly, "They thought they could scare me, they thought they could take what wasn't theirs, but all it took was the truth and the courage to stand by it." I smiled, pride swelling in my chest. And now they'll never forget it. The HOA had played their dirtiest card, but in the end, it was my wife's strength and the truth of her ownership that turned the tables. Their empire of intimidation collapsed, leaving only the lesson that power built on lies always falls. And as the dust settled, one thing was crystal clear. The HOA had lost far more than control. They had lost their credibility, their influence, and their fearsome grip on the community. Because when you send fake cops to intimidate someone who actually owns your property, you've already lost the game. If you think the HOA got what they deserved here, wait until you hear what happened. Next, don't miss it. Hit subscribe now.